Shabbat Shalom. This week we begin a new book, the fourth of the 5 books of the Torah, in Hebrew Bamidbar, generally called in English Numbers, and even in the Jewish tradition it's called Chomesh HaPekudim, because it begins with the census, extensive census of the Israelites. But actually, as we will see in a minute, that's not really the main theme of the book. The Bamidbar, like the rest of the other books, is introduced by the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe Nachmanides, very important and brilliant and original commentator who worked in northern Spain, mostly in the 13th century, but eventually spent the last years of his life in Eretz Yisrael. He placed great stock in the literary integrity and unity and then beauty of the Torah. The Torah does not simply, haphazardly present one issue after another, one chapter after another, one verse after another. And he introduces each of the books of the Torah with a short essay describing not only the main features of the book that he's about to comment on, but also how it ties together with the other books. If the first book, Bereshit, has the history, the prehistory of the world, the history of the forefathers whose efforts eventually, gave birth to the community that we call the Jewish people. Second book describes the birth of the Jewish people in slavery and exile, but the culmination at Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah, is the defining moment in Jewish history, and this is the central piece. And then in the third book, Vayikra, Numbers, we have, for the most part, descriptions of the sacrificial and other rituals in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. And then, now the Ramban tells us that there are many parallels between the Mount Sinai and the event there and the tabernacle. The two that I want to emphasize are restricted access. People were not allowed to, approach, even on pain of death. In Mount Sinai, Osakol, Isakel, or Yireh, anyone who came too close was threatening their own lives. And with regard to the Mishkan, Vazoya Krev Yumat. Just why there should be such severe penalties, particularly in the desert, is an interesting question, which I have something to say about in an article that came out in the latest issue of Dot. That's not what I'm talking about here. And some of these main, and then the other main point is the extensive preparations needed for anyone who was allowed to approach. With regard to Mount Sinai, the Torah says, even the priests who do approach God have to, sanctify themselves, make these extensive preparations. And the Rambam, Maimonides, makes a great deal of that verse as a sort of general rule in life. And then with regard to the tabernacle and eventually the temple, we have the laws of ritual purity, because you're not allowed, anyone who is ritually impure was not allowed to come into the temple, and to purify oneself was a long and difficult process at times. These same notions of a restricted access and extensive preparation were then transferred to the temple in Jerusalem. But Bamidbar, the book we're about to discuss, basically the Ramban ties it together, the Nachmanides ties it together with what has come by saying this is now the traveling sanctuary. In other words, at Mount Sinai, we had a fixed geographical landmark, the mountain called Sinai, which had only a temporary holiness. It's emphasized in Jewish tradition that there's nothing at all holy about Mount Sinai. It had was the holiest place in the world during the revelation of the Torah, but after the revelation of the Torah, it's no different, no holier, or no less holy than no holier than any other mountain. But then the holiness expressed as the place where the Shekhinah, where the divine presence dwelled, was basically transferred to the tabernacle, to the Mishkan, and that became sort of a traveling sanctuary, a traveling place of holiness, as it accompanied the Jewish people on their 40 years of wandering in the desert. And then, eventually, after many years, it was transferred to the temple in Jerusalem, where many of the same laws were put in place: the restricted access, the extensive preparation, and one more feature, the guards. There were guards posted around the temple. These were probably ceremonial guards. As the Ramban says, they were there to give, the place prestige. He quotes the Midrash as saying that a temple that has a palace, a royal palace that has guards is much more prestigious than one which is not. Up until very recently, I could have drawn an analogy to Buckingham Palace, where they had these guards in these fancy uniforms that were there only for photo ops for tourists. Now, unfortunately, as the world descends into chaos, the guards there are fulfilling a very important and needed task. And one can say perhaps the same thing about the Swiss guards in the Vatican. Now, the Rambam, moving back in time to a thinker who preceded the Ramban and had an entirely different worldview, Moses Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon. He, in fact, tells us that why we have to have restricted access, why we need these long processes of purification. And his explanation is totally at variance with what most people would tell you. According to the Rambam, there's absolutely nothing mystical, no spiritual degeneration, no evil or demonic spirit that gets into someone who has become ritually impure. It's purely a device to make people go through an extensive process of purification before they reach the temple. Now, the reason for this that he gives explicitly, and he says it twice in his Guide of the Perplexed, so it's not something that is no slip of the pen, and there really aren't any in the guide, is the following. He says that the temple, the main purpose of the temple is to inspire awe. That's the main purpose why we have a temple. To have this sanctuary that is so unusual, not just beautiful and impressive, but unusual, that whoever makes the pilgrimage and goes there will be awestruck. And as he says, a basic psychological fact that the more we become familiar with something, the less awestruck we are. Someone who gets to see the king or the president every day is not as put off by it or as excited by it as someone for whom it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Now, this is a little difficult, of course, not to speak of the difficulty with regard to so many people seem to think that tum'ah, ritual impurity, is some sort of spiritual state, some spiritual degeneration that has to be repaired. Absolutely nothing to it, nonsense, according to Maimonides. But Maimonides also doesn't think that there's any great added value to emotional reactions of awe and things like that. And we're not supposed to try to induce emotional reactions. We're supposed to practice and work hard at intellectual refinement. I don't know how to resolve this issue. And then, of course, there's the issue of the fact that ostensibly, theoretically, a Jew would have gone to the temple at least 3 times every year, which would have made it familiar. But it's very likely that in practice, not everyone was able to do it 3 times every year, and so it was really a rare event. In any event, the idea of extensive preparation is important for other reasons, because the extensive preparations, in particular the ritual purification, required a certain amount, perhaps a great amount, of social isolation, because the way one ritual impurity in Jewish law would be transferred very easily from person to person. Someone had been to a funeral and had touched someone else who had been to a funeral, and then touched someone else who had been to a funeral, and if we touch them, we become ritually impure with a severe impurity. So in order to purify oneself, one had to isolate oneself socially. And I think that from Maimonides' point of view, that in itself is a very worthy end for anyone who's on the spiritual path, because the social involvement is not just, hello, how are you, or closing business deals, or even, learning. And the type of meditation and concentration and intense reflection that's required for someone on the spiritual path advocated by Maimonides does require a form of isolation. Well, anyway, getting back to the idea of the sanctuary. Now, of course, we don't have the sanctuary, we don't have the temple, and some of the things, the points that I've made today, give us more reason to mourn for its loss. But we do have what the Jewish tradition calls Mikdash Ma'at, the minor sanctuary, the sanctuary in miniature, and that's the synagogue. But unfortunately, as most of us know, there's really no intensive preparation before entering the synagogue. People tend sometimes to rush there because they're late, and rush out because they have somewhere to go, and maybe not always be totally focused while there. And I think that's something to, bemoan, and something, that we can try to do something about. If I would just to, end this video with a plea not to talk to your neighbor, it wouldn't be very useful or have much of an impact, though I will do it anyway. But on the other hand, visiting a synagogue in off hours, when there aren't any prayers going on, if this is possible in a lot of places, again, because of the security worries we have in our own troubled times, it is not possible. That can be a much more inspiring experience, because it's quiet and one can soak in. I think I've had this experience myself, being in a shul just in some time in the afternoon when there's almost no one there, and sitting there, and because you're not supposed to just run through, sitting there saying a chapter or two of Tehillim, of Psalms, and thinking about the proper things, and then again trying to find some other ways, because we all seem to feel that what we need more than anything else for our get our spiritual journey on track is to sort of break out of the mold, break out of the daily routine, which we at the end of the day you just say, what happened today? Well, the same thing happened yesterday, and I didn't have time to think about what I was doing. So let's end here with this thought, and see how we can find the concentration to prepare ourselves before going to the synagogue, and find ways to in a very sort of almost structured and disciplined way get to detach ourselves from the daily routine and set our minds to higher things and higher goals. Thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom, v'chodesh tov, and hit the like button if you wish.